In 1999, the summer sun over Orlando was relentless, painting long shadows across the pavement and making every sound inside the Walt Disney World Resort feel distant, like echoes from a dream. It was July 18th, a Sunday, and by 3:45 p.m., the crowd at Magic Kingdom had swelled to thousands. Among them was a family from Liverpool, England, trying to stay together in the joyful chaos of it all. William Dubbs, 22, wore a simple gray t-shirt dampened with sweat and a red baseball cap that barely covered his short dark hair. A footballer for a modest club in the English Second Division, William had been living under the weight of expectations far greater than his paycheck. But here, on this trip, none of that mattered. He was just a father, a husband, and a son, trying to fulfill a promise. That promise was to his daughter, Lucy, 6 years old, who had begged him for over a year to take her to meet Cinderella and see the castle. He had finally agreed after months of injuries and missed birthdays. His father, Charles Dubbs, gray-haired, serious, and with a mind always calculating transfers and contracts, had helped book everything. It was their first family trip abroad in nearly a decade. At 3:48 p.m., something subtle broke the routine. They were near the entrance to Adventureland. Lucy wanted to go on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. William offered to take her, but she suddenly needed the restroom. His wife took her hand and headed toward the nearest sign. William waited near the benches under a shaded canopy, just a few feet from a cart selling water and pretzels. Charles was buying a soda. He turned to say something to William, and he was gone. No scream, no sound, just absence. In a park designed never to feel lonely, Charles suddenly did. At first, no one panicked. Charles thought William might have wandered into a nearby gift shop, or followed a vendor, or even gone to the restroom himself. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 30. When William's wife returned with Lucy, confusion gave way to concern. She asked what happened, and Charles couldn't explain it. They started walking in circles, calling his name, scanning the crowds of costumed children and adults. They split up and regrouped. They retraced steps, asked employees, even checked the ride lines. No sign. By 5:15 p.m., a quiet panic had started to throb beneath every word. A park employee was alerted. Security was called. They were told it was probably nothing. Adults disappear all the time in large parks, wander off, lose signal, step outside. But Charles knew his son, and his son wouldn't leave Lucy, not in the middle of her dream day. The sun began to set, golden light spilling over the tops of the fairy tale buildings. The music kept playing. The shows went on. But the Dubbs family wasn't smiling anymore. A report was filed. Authorities were involved by 8:00 p.m. William's name was entered into a missing persons system. The hotel room remained untouched. His passport was still inside. His football boots, he carried them even on vacations like a charm, were neatly placed by his suitcase. Lucy, curled up in her mother's lap, asked once where her daddy went. Then she didn't ask again. Charles spent that night sitting on the edge of his bed, watching the hallway of the resort hotel, waiting, hoping to hear the sound of a door opening. He didn't sleep. Neither did his daughter-in-law. The TV played cartoons softly in the background, the only sound breaking the silence. By morning, William Dubbs had been missing for 15 hours. The media in England picked up the story quickly. English footballer disappears in Orlando. But the reports were thin. No witnesses, no footage, no motive. It was as if the ground had swallowed him whole. And in a place built on fantasy, Charles was learning that nightmares sometimes begin with a simple turn of the head. William's red cap was found 2 days later, sitting on a bench in Frontierland. It was clean, unmarked, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. The weeks that followed William Dubbs's disappearance became a blur of unanswered calls, repeated interviews, and the deafening silence of systems too slow to understand urgency. Charles stayed in Orlando for over a month, refusing to return to England without his son. He paced the same park paths each day, rewalking the route between Adventureland and the restrooms, convinced he'd missed something, anything. Investigators reviewed every camera angle. There was a brief, grainy glimpse of someone who might have been William walking behind a churro stand at 3:52 p.m., but the figure never reappeared on the next camera, just 50 feet away. The footage skipped 2 seconds. A technical glitch, they said. Charles didn't believe in glitches anymore. Interpol got involved. Flyers went up. The British consulate monitored the case. Nothing. No calls. No notes. No sightings. no ransom. Just a player gone. Back home in Liverpool, Lucy refused to sleep in her own bed. She kept his boots beside her pillow. Sometimes she tied the laces together and wore them around her neck like a medal, whispering stories to them that she couldn't tell anyone else. His wife, Evelyn, couldn't pack up the closet. William's shirts hung untouched, their scent slowly fading. She stopped answering the phone, stopped opening the curtains. The neighborhood respected the silence around their house like it was holy ground. Each birthday was harder than the last. On Lucy's 7th, Charles brought a present wrapped in red paper, the same color as William's cap. It sat on the kitchen table for hours. Lucy wouldn't open it. "I'll wait until he comes back," she said. He never did. By 2004, William Dubb's name had mostly disappeared from the headlines. His club retired his number. Fans sang his name in the 22nd minute of every home game for a year. But eventually, new players came, new seasons started. The world moved on. But Charles didn't. Every year on July 18th, he returned to Orlando. He stayed in the same hotel, walked the same loop in the park, sat on the same bench where the cap had been found. The bench that had become, in some way, a gravestone without a grave. People thought he'd gone mad. Some said he was chasing ghosts. Others believed he knew something no one else did. But he never spoke about theories, never accused anyone, never speculated. He simply waited. At home, a spare room became a shrine. Newspaper clippings, photographs, letters, even Lucy's old drawings, stick figures holding hands, always in front of a castle. William's cleats, untouched since 1999, sat in a glass case Charles had built himself. One of them still had a strand of Magic Kingdom confetti stuck to the sole. Lucy grew into adolescence under a quiet storm. She never called her birthdays birthdays. She called them counting days. When asked, she said, "It's how many years since Daddy left?" Her teachers called for counselors. Evelyn tried therapy. Nothing worked, because there were no answers. And time, with its cruel indifference, only hardened the silence. By 2010, Evelyn stopped wearing her wedding ring. Not because she stopped loving William, but because the weight of hope had become heavier than the gold. She moved to Manchester with Lucy, far from the house and its ghosts. Charles stayed. Alone. In 2018, he suffered a minor stroke. Paralyzed briefly on his left side, he recovered physically, but something in him dimmed. He spoke less, smiled less, but he never stopped asking, did anyone check the tunnels under the park? Did anyone question the balloon vendor near Frontierland? Did they ever search the maintenance areas? People stopped answering him, but he never stopped asking. The pain had aged him beyond his years. Wrinkles that once came from sun now came from sorrow. His voice was gravelly, distant, as though it had to cross oceans just to be heard. 22 years had passed, and still, no one knew what had happened to William Dubbs, until, in 2021, deep in a swampy stretch of forest just outside the resort property, an area off-limits to the public, a discovery would change everything. But that's not where this story ends. It's where it begins again. In early September of 2021, the heat in central Florida still hung thick in the air, pressing down on everything like a forgotten weight. Deep beyond the visitor trails, in a fenced-off area of forested land once used for behind-the-scenes construction staging, a team of university archaeologists had been granted permission to conduct an environmental study on former swamp territory. It was supposed to be routine: soil samples, vegetation impact, minor topographic surveys. But on the third day, as they were clearing vines and debris near a shallow, long-dried creek bed, one of the graduate students spotted something metallic glinting beneath the roots of a cypress. At first it looked like a piece of machinery, then a shoe, then nearby a plastic ID badge, weather-worn but partially legible. The name read, William Dubbs. Authorities were called. The area was immediately sealed. The forest had kept its secrets well. No signposts. No evidence of recent human passage. Just trees, mud, and the ghost of something long buried. At the edge of the brush, tucked beneath a collapsed wooden platform likely used in the late 90s, search teams found a torn canvas duffel bag. Inside, a mold-damaged journal with the initials WD, a team patch from his English club, and a folded water-damaged drawing, a child's picture of a castle, drawn in crayon. In one corner, 2 stick figures holding hands. One wore a red cap. The press was cautious at first. News of the rediscovery didn't break until days later. By then, Charles had already been informed. The phone call came in the early morning, his voice trembling as he asked the question that had haunted him for over 2 decades. Is it really him? Confirmation took days. A DNA match. A statement from officials. A date set for a press conference. But Charles didn't care for any of it. He flew to Florida without waiting. He didn't cry when they handed him the drawing. He didn't speak when they showed him the cleats, still inside the bag, hardened by time, one of them stained faintly with what looked like red confetti, the same confetti he had seen falling from the parade floats in 1999. He simply stared, as if, after all these years, his eyes had forgotten how to look at something that wasn't loss. Back in Liverpool, Lucy, now 28, received the news not from a phone call, but from a message forwarded by a co-worker. She stared at the screen in silence, reading the headline again and again. Remains of missing English footballer discovered near Disney. ID confirms it's William Dubbs. For a moment, she thought she'd imagined it. For years, she'd convinced herself that her father was alive somewhere, under another name perhaps, or struck with amnesia. She'd created entire stories in her mind. Maybe he was in Spain, painting houses, or living in a remote cabin. Maybe he had forgotten who he was, but somehow, she would be the one to bring him back. But the red cap? The drawing? It wasn't a reunion. It was recognition. Days later, in a small memorial room just outside the coroner's office, Lucy met Charles again. He was thinner, slower. Time had carved deep lines into his face, but the way he looked at her, that hadn't changed. She sat beside him on the bench. Neither spoke. In front of them, the duffel bag sat on a polished table. She opened it slowly, pulled out the drawing. Her fingers brushed the crayon lines. "Do you remember when we made this?" Charles asked. She nodded. "He told me it would hang in his locker." "He kept it," Charles whispered. A silence passed. A deep, emotional stillness that filled the room more than any words could. Lucy reached for the cap. Its color faded, its fabric brittle. She placed it gently in her lap. Her fingers trembled, but her voice didn't when she said, "I'm ready to stop waiting." Charles didn't answer. But for the first time in years, he let out a breath that didn't carry pain. Autumn in England carried a different kind of chill that year. The sky over Liverpool was leaden, and the streets breathed a quiet grief. At the modest stadium where William Dubbs had once played, the club organized a tribute. It wasn't a funeral. There was no coffin, no procession, just a silent afternoon, an empty field, and the number 22 illuminated on the scoreboard. Lucy arrived early and kept to the back, away from cameras. She held her father's duffel bag tightly on her lap, the same one recovered from the Florida forest, still bearing the patch of his old club. Inside it, his football boots, stiff with time, and the drawing. That simple child's crayon sketch of a castle and 2 stick figures holding hands. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up years ago. What she carried now was heavier, quieter, a grief with no shape, no volume, just weight. Charles sat beside her, slower now, his hair gone entirely white, his hands always trembling slightly. His eyes, once sharp with ambition, now wandered as if always looking for something just out of reach. For years he had chased theories, searched shadows, studied maps. But today, he sat still. After the tribute, he invited Lucy back to the house. The same house, same hallway, same creaking step halfway up the stairs. Time had passed, but the house felt preserved, untouched by anything except sorrow. He led her into his study. The room was packed with documents, newspapers, maps, letters, even old cassette recordings of police interviews. On the desk sat a small wooden box. "It was his," Charles said quietly. "I took it from the hotel room. Never opened it." Lucy opened the lid. Inside, a hotel room keychain, a park admission ticket, a child's bracelet with Lucy handwritten on the tag, and a photo. It was taken on the second day of their trip, Lucy sitting on William's shoulders, both beaming in front of Cinderella's castle. His red cap sat crooked on his head, his t-shirt smudged with ice cream. She looked like joy. He looked like peace. On the back, in William's handwriting, "She is my crown." Lucy held the photo to her chest, her fingers trembling. "He didn't leave us," she said softly. "He was coming with us." Charles didn't speak. He didn't need to. That night, The house felt different. Charles slept with the hallway light off for the first time in years. Lucy didn't check the windows before bed, and for the first time since 1999, the house didn't feel like it was waiting. A few days later, Lucy made a decision. She booked a flight and returned alone to Orlando, not to investigate, but to say goodbye. She retraced their steps. The streets were louder now. New attractions had replaced old ones, but one thing hadn't changed: the quiet iron bench between Adventureland and Frontierland. It had been repainted, but it was the same bench, the one where they'd found William's red cap. She sat down, took the duffel bag from her lap and pulled out the boots, placed them gently on the bench, then the drawing, and finally, the cap. Its color faded, the fabric fragile, but still unmistakable. She didn't speak, just sat, her hands folded, eyes closed. A parade passed nearby. Laughter echoed. Red and silver confetti floated through the air. Lucy looked up at the sky, then back at the bench. She rose slowly, smoothed the cap with her palm, and walked away. She didn't carry the bag anymore. She carried herself. Weeks after Lucy's quiet goodbye in Florida, a letter arrived at Charles Dubb's home in Liverpool. It bore the official seal of the U.S. Department of the Interior. The envelope was thick, unusually heavy. Inside was a cover letter, a sealed USB drive, and a note scribbled in pen at the bottom margin. "Thought you should see this. It came up during property archive audits." Charles took the contents to his desk and sat for a long time before inserting the drive into his old laptop. The screen flickered and then a folder opened, labeled 1999, Utility Map Logs, Park Expansion Zone 4. Inside, dozens of scanned documents. Floor plans, blueprints, handwritten maintenance reports, faded security logs. But one file caught his eye. A scanned report dated July 20th, 1999, 2 days after William disappeared. The report was from a subcontracted utility team, hired by the Resort for Underground Infrastructure Assessment in an undeveloped wooded area adjacent to the park, technically private land, but outside guest access zones. Unsecured access panel found near temporary staging platform. Human item recovered. Escalated to site ops, instructed to seal entry pending inspection. There was a photograph attached. A metal grate, partially ajar. A red cloth, folded, half hidden beneath leaves. Charles froze. He recognized that cloth. It was William's red cap. Why hadn't anyone mentioned this in 1999? Why hadn't he seen this report? He kept digging. A handwritten memo followed, dated July 23, 1999. From Site Operations Management. Access point now sealed per safety. No staff reported item loss. No additional inquiry required per internal guidelines. Logged as inconclusive. There were more memos filed sporadically over the next 2 years. Mentions of staff transitions, project cancellations, documentation loss due to water damage, bureaucratic phrases detached and clinical. But the pattern was clear. They had found something, and they had buried it. That same week, Lucy received a call from an academic at the University of Central Florida. One of the graduate students from the 2021 expedition had been researching the utility history of the land where William's remains were found. The site, it turned out, had once been part of a proposed resort expansion project in the late 1990s, one that was abruptly canceled and then redistricted as a conservation buffer. When Lucy asked why the project was halted, the answer was quiet. No one really knows. The paperwork stops cold after July of '99. Back in Liverpool, Charles met with a local solicitor. He wasn't seeking legal revenge, he was seeking acknowledgement. The solicitor advised patience. "Too much time has passed," he said. "Too many departments. Too much red tape." But Charles didn't want a lawsuit. He wanted the truth, even if it came too late to matter. In October of 2021, he gave an interview to a local paper, just one. He didn't sensationalize anything. He didn't accuse. He simply told the story as he knew it. A father's wait, a daughter's drawing, a forgotten trail in a place built to never forget. The article went modestly viral, not because of scandal, but because of silence. People connected with the quiet pain, with the years lost, with the idea of someone waiting that long, and then finding only memories. A few weeks later, a box arrived at his doorstep. No return address. Inside, a weathered maintenance badge, dated 1999. a folded piece of resort stationery, and a single sentence typed, "I tried to report it, I'm sorry no one listened." Charles didn't show the box to the police. He didn't call the press. He placed it in the same cabinet where he kept William's cleats, closed the drawer, and left it there. In December, Lucy returned to her childhood home for the holidays. They sat together on the couch, a fire warming the living room. "I think I'm going to change my name," she said. Charles looked at her. "To what?" "Lucy Dubs," she said. "I want to carry it." He nodded slowly. She reached into her bag and pulled out the photo again, the one of her and William in front of the castle. She had made a copy, had it framed. She handed it to Charles. "For the hallway," she said. He stood and walked to the wall, removed an old landscape painting, replaced it with the frame, stepped back. The hallway light caught the glass. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Outside, snow began to fall. Quiet, slow, gentle, covering the street like a promise. And for the first time in over 2 decades, there were no more questions, no more theories, only the truth. Quiet and incomplete, but enough. That night, as Lucy prepared for bed, she sat by the window and whispered something she'd carried inside her for years. "You didn't come back, Dad, but I found you anyway. And sometimes, that's all a heart needs. Not answers, but arrival."